Welcome, listeners, to the InFAWmation Nation, brought to you by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Division of Fish and Wildlife, Hunter Education Program. This is Scott Travers, the Hunter Education Coordinator for the state of Rhode Island. I'm here with my production assistant and administrative assistant, Maddie Prue. We are coming to you live from the Outdoor Education Office in Exeter, Rhode Island, which is located within the Arcadia Management Area. As always, our focus is on hunting, hunter education, fishing, aquatic education, and all things wildlife outreach related in the state of Rhode Island. In this episode, we'll be talking with Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife's Marine Fisheries Division Chief, Conor McManus. Conor, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, great to have you here. So can you tell us a little about yourself? Like, where are you from originally?
Absolutely. So I'm from Massachusetts originally, growing up splitting my time between a suburb just outside of Boston and then as well in Cape Cod, where that's where my true interest and passions for fisheries and marine science really grew. And spending my childhoods between Boston and Cape Cod, I then, after college, then moved to Rhode Island here, where I've been since. And moved here originally for grad school, where I did my master's in oceanography at the URI's Bay campus. Then subsequent to that, did my PhD at the URI Bay campus. So been here now for over a decade and haven't left yet.
Fantastic. Yeah, so another URI alumni on the show.
That's correct, yeah.
Fantastic. So let me ask, what got you into marine fisheries? I know you said it was your time up the Cape. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how you got into your current position?
Sure. So yeah, growing up, I spent most of my time at the beach in true, I guess, marine biology fashion, continuously snorkeling, searching, looking for creatures, trying to understand the marine environment. That segued into trying to take more classes in Woods Hole, where most of the marine science origins for the United States began back centuries ago. And since then, I've slowly, as a child, learning through coursework, summer camps, classwork. Then in college, really going to school focused on marine science at Boston University, doing the BU Marine program, intense marine science education. And then that coupled with various opportunities working for the New England Aquarium, Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, I thought to myself, this is certainly the path I want to be on, and I pursued grad school right thereafter. And so that's when I moved to Rhode Island, and I started working on oceanographic topics as a master's student here at URI, but my work focused on Massachusetts Bay, trying to understand phytoplankton and how they both fuel the ecosystem for things like whales and larger plankton and small fish, but then also understanding what drives those patterns and in the ocean. How do the currents and the winds and river runoff actually dictate what's available for the food at the base of the food web in the ocean, with focus on Massachusetts Bay. I spent a while doing that, a few years after leaving BU. I then left actually for a consulting firm that was a subcontractor to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, that was looking at the Deepwater Horizon oil spill case in the Gulf of Mexico. So I spent quite a bit of time working with a team of both consultants and federal scientists and academics that were charged with understanding or estimating the damages from the oil spill as it related to the marine biota, most often fish larvae that would otherwise have grown up to be a harvestable recreational fish, as an example, and get an understanding for those losses from the spill, and then trying to build plans that would allow for restoring those losses. So I spent a few years doing that, and then I also at that time started my doctorate at the URI Bay campus part-time, and this time focusing on larval fish ecology and fisheries oceanography for Atlantic mackerel, trying to understand the impacts of climate change and harvest pressure and other ecosystem considerations on that stock, and understanding through time those interactions with Atlantic mackerel. about 3 or 4 years into that consulting job, I left that and came to DEM as a principal biologist and working on a slew of different topics from quahogs to lobsters to Jonah crab, and over time since then have worked on a number of different species like winter flounder and summer flounder, various coastal shark species, and then other species that then interact, other animals that then interact with commercial fisheries such as dolphins and whales and turtles as they interact with either harvesters, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, or with the public, strandings and such. So, with DEM, Marine Fisheries being a small group, the luxury is we get to work on a wide variety of things and really understand marine fisheries holistically. So, since joining DEM as a biologist, I've moved on a couple times to now being the chief, where I oversee the division's missions of looking to run the fishery science and management plans and programs for the state of Rhode Island, and looking to ensure sustainable fisheries for all stakeholders indefinitely.
Well, that's great. Well, you definitely sound like the right guy for the job. You're very well-rounded.
Oh, thanks.
So, yeah, fantastic. So, now, how big is the Marine Fisheries Division in the state of Rhode Island?
Sure. I would say generally we have full-time employees somewhere between 20 to 25 in general, depending on new contract employees that we'll bring on, or as well as the existing state employees. So I still consider us pretty small, a small group, but we have a number of different seasonal employees that come on each year to either work with our recreational fisheries program on capturing fisheries data from the recreational community, as well as in student researchers that will come on and help us with our surveys and learn about fisheries science and management, and then as well as park rangers that help us maintain our fishing access points. So in total, at a given time, we may have 35 staff that are working with us, 36 in the peak months of the year. So we, as well, are kind of split between two different offices. Our headquarters, I would say, is in Jamestown and Fort Wetherill, where most of us are reporting to daily. We also have a coastal field office in Jerusalem, the Coastal Fisheries Lab, right across from the Port of Galilee on Point Judith Pond, which is primarily housing our marine recreational program.
Right, gotcha. And I know from my own experience, those seasonal employees, and all those other people, boy, they're really important to our programs.
Without them, we wouldn't be able to get our work done. What DEM is charged with completing but not just the stakeholders of Rhode Island and per our programs, but then also the federal entities that we're working with that are looking to get the information and data that we're charged with collecting to help inform coastwide fisheries science and management.
Right, absolutely. So what is the condition of the marine fisheries in the state of Rhode Island?
I think I would certainly say it depends who you ask and what fisheries you're interested in, for sure. I think we've seen some stocks, and some species like winter flounder and American lobster, their abundance decline through time, with those two species being prominent historical, recreational, and commercial fisheries, respectively. So, for those two stocks, I would say the condition is poor comparative to the late 90s and such. We've also had, though, in the last 5-10 years, the emergence of new fisheries. I would say black sea bass is one species that I would say our commercial and recreational communities are highly interested in and reliant on. Summer flounder is another one. Scup is another one. And then in the lobster world, Jonah crab is another species that has not necessarily emerged as more abundant, but certainly a species that our coastal communities and our seafood community are reliant on in terms of both for livelihood and landing, but then also supplying seafood to our state.
Right. So what are some of the factors affecting the winter flounder and lobster populations?
Yeah, and I think for those species, I think it's certainly true that harvest pressure in terms of how much you can take annually plays some role in that. But those are two stocks that at this point have really had their population dynamics influenced by climate and the ecosystem. Both, I would say, could be considered losers of climate change, if you will, in terms of warmer waters and how that affects not just them directly, either their ability to stay alive in hot waters or warmer waters, or their ability to continue to grow, reproduce, mature, those types of aspects. But then also indirectly, as the water's warm, you have changes in your other ecosystem components, not just habitat, but other animals that may now be able to thrive here. And so you have a shift in all species, which then changes the interactions between those species. Whether that's more black sea bass may lead to more predation on lobsters, and that's an indirect effect from climate change. In the case of winter flounder, it's been hypothesized that warmer waters, particularly when they're eggs, might now increase the overlap between other predators like crangon shrimp that might eat them at these really baby stages, and that we didn't have 20, 30 years ago because it was too cold for the crangon to be there at the same temporal overlap. So there's a number of different ecosystem considerations. Lobster is unique additionally because we know that there's also a disease component that seems to be more prevalent with warming waters. So we see the natural mortality of lobsters not just impacted by perhaps increased predation, but then also a disease component, which is another challenge. And I think in fisheries management, when you have these other factors now influencing your stock or your species, what are the tools we can have to regulate ecosystem versus commercial harvest or fishing mortality, which is more traditional and more transparent in terms of reducing the amount you take. But these ecosystem considerations are really challenging, and many of them are emerging as the primary mechanism for influencing the stock dynamics for species. So it's a moving target and a little bit unknown in how we address those topics in terms of how it influences the management structure, while also acknowledging that when commercial harvesters are not necessarily the driver of a certain species decline, making sure that we address the problem directly as opposed to simply reducing catch allowance.
Right, gotcha. Yeah, so again, climate change affecting the marine population.
Yeah, and I would say, being in the ocean, animals are highly influenced by the temperature of said ocean. And as that changes, they have to then try and be able to either regulate their own temperatures or move to areas that allow them to survive. And in some instances, that can be the truncation or contraction of a range of where the species can live, based on habitat suitability changing in areas that used to be good. But then also in these winters might have climate change might have their areas expand into new areas. And so you have a mix of both new opportunities and lost opportunities as a commercial or recreational harvester in what you can catch.
Right.
And so it's across the board, and we oftentimes think about that in the context of the species we see every day and that we interact with every day, whether we're rod and reeling or we're using a certain net. Those are the ones we interact. But the impacts of climate, of a warming climate or a changing environment over time, those effects are apparent throughout the ecosystem at various levels.
Right, gotcha. So do you see a lot of those populations moving to the north, further north on the coast?
Generally speaking, a lot of what we've seen to date is the center of biomass for species on the East Coast moving northeast through time. There are exceptions to that, and there are some differences amongst taxa, or species rather. But generally speaking, yes, we have seen a lot of species like black sea bass and summer flounder moving north through time, and we've seen that again also with lobster. But oftentimes, when people hear that, they think that a species might be packing up their bags from Maryland and moving up to Rhode Island, and it's not necessarily that they're moving farther. It's that new habitat is available now for those fish to spawn, reproduce, and have their eggs grow up into future adults. So it's a bit of, there is some component of migration, but it's really based about, is this environment now suitable for an animal to grow from egg to adult? And that's what we're seeing for a lot of species.
Right, gotcha. So I know you mentioned black sea bass and scup and the Jonah crab. Are there any positive things going on?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think we're seeing more of them, which aside from ecosystem impacts of new species moving in, I do think it's giving recreational anglers and commercial harvesters an opportunity to access these fish. Now, it's certainly true that in some instances, the management world may not reflect um, in terms of what we as Rhode Island compared to other states are allowed to take. That may not be completely reflective of what we're seeing in terms of more fish here than we could actually take. But in terms of still access, those are species that we continue to harvest, pretty thoroughly in Rhode Island. Seem right now to be rather sustainable, which is great. We will continue in Rhode Island to work towards making sure the availability of fish up here and the management that allows us to access those fish become in sync. It's a long process as you work with partners down the East Coast and understanding the pros and cons of doing so coastwide. But those are certainly positives in terms of the species here. But there's a lot of other species that people are looking to also access, like tautog, and that's a highly recreational fish and certainly caught by commercial folks as well. And again, the Jonah crab's one where we actually don't know what its population status is. It's what we call a data limited species. We don't know very well how fast it grows, how fast it dies, how fast it matures. Those are things we're still looking at, but it's been really important for the lobster fishery over the last 10 to 15 years to have another crustacean species that they intercept be profitable for harvest.
Right.
Again, we think a lot about it being diverse or adaptable to as a fisherman under climate change or under ecosystem change even, or in harvesting pressures coastwide into these new opportunities as they present themselves. So
Right.
especially as in this example, lobster declining.
Gotcha. So, how about the striped bass migration?
Sure. So for striped bass, we've certainly seen that in recent years, the stock is at low abundance, which is, I think, many people have recently seen the changes in management, principally like the circle hook, which requirement, which we've been working with outreach educators on in the recreational community to make sure there's an understanding that is that's applied and people understand the positives of these management tools and helping rebuild the stock. But generally every year we'll see the striped bass move up. They'll use waters of Rhode Island and other coastal areas for spawning and feeding, or primarily feeding at this time of year. And then as they stay here, get bigger, they'll make that fall migration, anywhere from September, October, maybe even late August. But I think generally speaking, our harvesters or recreational anglers have seen them this year. I think changes in size limit requirements has certainly been a challenge in terms of accessing fish, but a lot of the measures we're looking to do coastwide, mind you, are trying to help us rebuild to a level that allows us to have a healthy population as well as ideally more access to the fish in the future. So
Right. So you mentioned circle hooks. Can we just talk about that briefly and what benefit that has as a tool?
sure, no, it's a great point. So typically one of the pathways for recreational fish to die when it being intercepted is through discard mortality. So for example, if a fish is in the case of striped bass too small or too big, you'd have to release them. Depending on the hook that's used, that can have different physiological damage to the fish, whether it's a circle hook or a J hook. They have different effects on the post-release condition of the fish and ultimately then post-release mortality. So our goal with using circle hooks is that studies have found, generally for marine species especially, that the circle hook is less intrusive. It allows the hook to set right inside the mouth of the fish, easy to get out, and reduces the probability of it being swallowed or some other type of snag that might cause more harm to the fish. And so part of the measure is to try and ensure that when we release the fish, it can go back and spawn even if we can't take it and contribute to the population. Discard mortality is a chronic problem amongst fisheries, or a chronic source of total mortality, and for some more than others. And we see it oftentimes with the hook work in recreational fisheries. But The goal is that with the circle hook we can reduce the release mortality for striped bass, and it should be noted that it's not while it's new for striped bass, it's not new for other species. So we use the same application for coastal sharks in trying to ensure that when we release them, they don't the traditional J hook that may get swallowed or get caught somewhere else is no longer an impact, because by moving to circle hook, the probability of that happening decreases and allows it for a cleaner set inside the right inside the mouth. And the I guess the classic question is always, how does that impact your catch rate of the species as a result? And I think the idea is to try and use somewhat of a conservation-minded approach in order to help us rebuild these stocks, particularly like striped bass or shortfin mako that are currently overfished.
Right. So you talked about bracketing limits, and if you could just explain what you mean by that, that way our listeners will know.
Absolutely, yeah. So typically one of the tools we use to manage marine fish are size limits. We have things from minimum sizes where an animal has to be over a certain size in order for you to take it. We also have maximum size limits, and where if an animal's above a certain size, you can't take it. For the minimum size, the idea is that we want the animal to grow to a certain size and age that allows it to at least reproduce once before being harvested, and then contribute to the spawning stock and the overall population moving forward by reproducing. The maximum size is a similar goal, but in a different direction, in that typically what we find in marine species is that as you get bigger, the more eggs you produce per body weight. So it's not a linear thought of fish this big produces this eggs and this and that. It is a relationship, but you get more, for lack of a better phrase, bang for your buck in terms of your egg production for a given animal as you get bigger. So in terms of species where we have maximum sizes, the hope is that these bigger ones that are left out there actually count or produce more eggs than a fish that's smaller, compared 1-to-1. So by leaving a big one out there, you're actually helping get more spawning production completed than a fish just under the minimum size. So they're both geared towards helping produce a future population via spawning, but with slightly different mindsets on the understanding and logistics of egg production, if you will.
Right, gotcha.
And so we try to base those size limits not just on reproductive curves and what's available in the stock, but then also trying to understand what's the harvest size spectrum that we're seeing,
right,
and how does that interact with this maturity curve or maturity trajectory for a given species over time, over age, or over size.
Gotcha. I appreciate you explaining that, because I think it's a lot easier for people to adhere to the rules if they understand the reasons why they're in place and what the intent is behind them.
And I think I completely agree. And I think it hits also on the importance of outreach and education, particularly when regulations come out. Because I think ultimately, not only does it help for people to perhaps adhere to them, but then also just as avid lovers of the resource, you get to better understand what you're looking at every time you reel up a fish,
Right.
and it gives you perspective. I've always found it fun, both as a recreational angler and as a scientist, when I haul up a fish, to think, oh, this one may have spawned already once or twice in its life, or oh, this is a baby, it hasn't spawned yet. So I think that education and outreach for all folks is paramount, not just for successful management and implementation of regulations, but then also just as avid lovers for the animals themselves.
Right, absolutely. So do we see, or are we expecting any changes in current regulations in the near future?
I would say, generally speaking, no, in terms of the minimum sizes, maximum sizes, bag limits. We certainly are annually always open to those requests as they come up annually. So we will likely have changes in some of these elements. And what we are allowed to do or not do annually is somewhat predicated on the fact that we manage a lot of these species coastwide. So a lot of what we're doing for striped bass, it's not a Rhode Island-centric, closed-minded mentality. We're working with Massachusetts and Maine and Connecticut and Maryland on these programs because these fish move all up and down the coast. So we want to be in sync in our goals in trying to rebuild stocks with different states. So I guess my short answer to your question is we could see some changes in regulations, whether that be start and end dates or days open or minimum sizes for certain species. It's to be determined if that will happen. I mean, most of our responses to those are predicated off of the public wanting to see something different. Whether it's that they want black sea bass season to start earlier because they're in the bay, or they want it to stay where it is because that's when they can actually get access to the water and it's warm and it's easy to get out, and by doing so you can catch more, because we're only allowed a certain number of fish to catch. Mm-hmm. So for most of the species that we manage. So I guess the short answer is yes and no, because we don't have a plan for a lot of our species to change them now, but we are always open to trying to optimize the harvest opportunities for folks that allow us to maintain sustainable stocks.
Right. I think the important takeaway is that we do communicate with the neighboring states, and we do take into account the migration patterns and what other states are doing. It's part of the bigger picture.
100%. And again, when you have a resource that's transboundary, it moves across different state lines. Any effort that you're doing in your state could or could not be not for nothing if you don't coordinate with the other state, with other partners in states. So, and we do that with other states as well as federal entities, because a lot of these species don't just move up and down, but they move in and out. So we work closely with our federal partners or other state partners to try and inform fisheries management programs that allow the stock to be rebuilt or stay over a good target for it or for them, and then allow for any management that one state does to actually achieve its purpose.
Right. Well, thank you, Conor. That's about all the time we have for this episode of the InFAWmation Nation. Looks like we're going to have to continue our discussion next month. So stay tuned for our next episode where we wrap up with Conor McManus, Division Chief from Marine Fisheries. And until next time, as always, we encourage our listeners everywhere to get outside and enjoy the wonderful outdoor world and the natural resources we all share